My name is Renata Kowalczyk. I go by Ren, and I am 41 years old. On the morning my father tried to sign away the family orchard for $4 million, I was standing at the old iron headgate on Plumb Creek with my grandfather's brass key still warm in my palm, because it was Tuesday, and on Tuesdays I opened the water for the upper ditch before the office even opened. I did not know yet that a closing was scheduled for that same afternoon in a conference room in Yakima, 40 minutes south, or that my name, not my father's, not my stepmother's, was the one line in that whole transaction nobody at that table had bothered to check. I only knew the water was running low and cold over my boots, and that the key in my hand was worn smooth in the exact place my grandfather's thumb used to rest. I did not know it yet, but by the end of that week I would understand why my grandfather had pressed that key into my hand the summer I turned 19, and told me, "Water remembers who tends it, longer than people remember who loves them." The Kowalczyk place sat along Plum Creek, outside a town most maps barely bothered to label. A few hundred people, one blinking light, and a grain elevator that had not held grain in decades. Real geography was easy to place if you knew apple country. The town sat up the valley from Yakima, Washington, tucked between basalt bluffs and rows of Honeycrisp and Gala that my grandfather Casimir Kowalczyk had planted with his own hands after he came home from the war with nothing but a discharge paper and a stubborn streak. He dug the first ditch himself with a borrowed mule and a shovel, and when the district organized the water rights on paper decades later, his was one of the oldest and best on the creek, a senior right, first in time and first in line, which in water law out west means everyone downstream waits until you have had your fill. I grew up understanding water the way other kids understood math facts, by repetition, by feel, by the sound a headgate made when it was set right versus when it was fighting you. My grandfather used to crouch beside me at the wheel and count out loud while he turned it, not for accuracy. He already knew exactly how many turns opened it halfway, but because counting kept a person honest and slow, which mattered more than being fast. I can still hear him doing it, a low, steady count that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with patience. My mother, Helena, died when I was in my middle 20s. Ovarian cancer that moved faster than any of us were braced for. And after that, it was my father Walt and me and my grandfather for a long stretch of quiet years that were not unhappy, just careful, the three of us moving around each other in a house that had gotten too big. My father loved the orchard the way a person loves a family photograph, fondly, from a comfortable distance, without ever wanting to be the one holding the ladder. He had tried running the business side once in his 30s and nearly lost the whole operation on a handshake hop contract with a broker who turned out to be selling promises he could not keep. My grandfather bailed him out that time, quietly, and never let him forget it, not cruelly, just as a fact that sat between them the rest of their lives, the way certain facts do in families that do not talk about money out loud. I was the one who went and got a real degree in water resource technology 2 hours away, came home most summers to run ditches with my grandfather, and eventually took a staff position with the Plum Creek Irrigation District, the outfit that manages who gets water and when along our stretch of the valley. I worked my way up to assistant watermaster, which meant I kept the delivery schedules, tracked every parcel's priority date, ran the gauge readings during drought years when tempers ran hotter than the creek, and made the calls nobody wanted to get, telling a grower his turn was over even when his trees were thirsty and his neighbor's turn was next. My father called it my little water job, the way you might refer to a hobby a person had not quite grown out of. At family gatherings, if anyone asked what I did, he would answer for me before I could open my mouth, "Oh, Ren keeps the paperwork straight down at the ditch company," and then pivot to whatever Cody, my stepbrother, was building that season. Because by then there was a Cody, and a Deborah, and a whole new arrangement none of us had asked for out loud, but all of us had learned to live inside. My father married Deborah Sallow about 8 years after my mother passed. A soft-spoken woman from the coast who had been through a hard first marriage of her own, and who arrived already carrying a grown son, Cody, sharp-dressed, always between business ventures, always one deal away from the big one. I tried, in the beginning, to want it to work. I brought a casserole to their wedding reception, which was held at a banquet hall out past the highway, and I hugged Deborah and told her I was glad my father was not alone anymore, and I meant it, mostly. What I did not understand yet was that Deborah had married a man with land, and that Cody had inherited from somewhere the particular talent of looking at a working orchard and seeing, instead of trees, an event venue with string lights and a tasting room. My grandfather did not care for any of it. Not the wedding, not Cody's talk of potential, not the way Deborah rearranged the kitchen the first month she moved in without asking where anything had lived before. He was over 80 by then, slower, but his mind stayed sharp as a fresh-cut fence post, and one afternoon that same year he asked me to drive him into town, to the courthouse, and would not tell me why. I sat in the truck while he went inside with a folder I had never seen before, and when he came back out, he handed me a single brass key, old, heavy, worn on one edge, and told me it belonged to the head gate on the 40 acres along the creek, the parcel with the original water right on it, the one his own father had never even owned, the one Casimir himself had bought free and clear the year I was born. "Keep this on you," he said, "not in a drawer, on you." I asked him why, and he just said that a man who trusts easily should never be the only name on a deed, and that he had fixed that, quietly, the way he fixed most things, and that I would understand when I needed to, and not one day before. I thought he meant his will. I thought a lot of things I would later learn were only half true. That same afternoon, driving home, he told me something else I did not understand the weight of until much later. He said that trust, real trust, was not a feeling a person carried around and handed out freely. It was a structure a person built, plank by plank, the same way you built a headgate strong enough to hold back a whole spring runoff without giving an inch. Feelings changed with the weather, he said. Structures did not, if you built them right the first time. He died 2 winters later, in his sleep, in the same bedroom he had shared with my grandmother for over 50 years. I kept the key on my ring after that, mostly out of sentiment, a small brass weight next to my car key and my office key, and if you had asked me in those years what it opened, I would have told you, correctly but incompletely, the head gate. I did not yet know it also opened something else. The first crack came on a Sunday in early autumn. At the harvest dinner my father still insisted on hosting every year. Folding tables set up under the big walnut tree, a spread of food from the Cascade griddle in town, because Deborah did not cook much anymore, and nobody minded, and every cousin and neighbor within a half-hour's drive crowded onto the lawn. I came straight from the ditch in my work boots, because harvest never waited for anyone's outfit, and Deborah looked at my boots the way she always did, like they were a small ongoing insult to the tablecloth. Cody stood up before dessert with a laptop under his arm, grinning the grin he used on people he was about to ask for money. He had renderings, actual architectural renderings, of the 40 acres along the creek, the same 40 acres my grandfather's key belonged to, redrawn as a wedding venue with a tasting room and a row of guest cottages where the oldest apple trees currently stood. He called it Plumb Creek Hollow, said the valuation numbers were staggering, once the water situation got sorted out, said a resort group out of Seattle had already walked the property twice. My father clapped along with the rest of the table. Deborah beamed like Cody had just announced a grandchild. And when I asked, carefully, what he meant by the water situation getting sorted out, since I happened to be the person whose entire job was the water situation, Cody laughed and said he did not want to bore me with the technical stuff. That was more my father's department now, and my father, without even glancing my way, said, "Oh, Wren just runs the paperwork on that. She will get us squared away, won't you, sweetheart?" Deborah patted my hand across the table and said, "Isn't it nice that even the water girl gets to feel useful at these things?" My Aunt Renee, my mother's older sister, caught my eye from across the table for just a second. The kind of look that says, "I heard that too, and I am sorry nobody is going to say anything about it." And then the moment passed the way those moments always did at that table, swallowed by the next round of dessert plates and the next round of Cody's talk about staggering valuations. Nobody laughed, exactly, but nobody corrected her either, and my father's silence sat in my chest heavier than the laugh would have. I did not know it yet, but I would hear that phrase again, in a much quieter room, at the exact moment it stopped being an insult and started being evidence. The 2 years after that dinner moved the way erosion moves, so slow you cannot see it happening until you notice the bank is gone. Deborah started answering my father's phone for him, telling me he was resting when I called on a Tuesday evening, telling me he was napping when I called on a Thursday, until I stopped calling as often, because it started to feel like intruding on something, rather than checking on my own father. She began driving him to his own doctor's appointments and coming into the room with him, and when I asked once if I could come along to the cardiologist, she told me it might be overwhelming for him, too many people, better to keep it simple. My father, who used to call me every single Sunday just to talk about nothing, started letting those calls go to voicemail more often than he answered them. There was one visit in particular I still think about from that stretch. A Saturday, I drove out unannounced because I had not heard my father's voice in nearly 3 weeks, and my chest had gotten tight enough about it that I could not talk myself out of going. Deborah met me at the door before I even reached it, told me my father was resting, that he had a rough night, that maybe I could come back another time when he was up for company. Through the screen door behind her, I could see him sitting perfectly upright at the kitchen table, reading the paper, looking, from where I stood, entirely fine. I did not push my way in. I have wondered since whether I should have. I said I understood, and I drove the 40 minutes home with the radio off, the whole way, because I did not trust my own voice to sing along with anything. Cody kept moving forward with Plumb Creek Hollow the whole time, a little further each season, an environmental consultant hired to walk the property, an architect's stamped drawings, meetings with a resort group whose name I only ever heard secondhand. I told myself it was still just talk, the kind of grand plan that never survives contact with an actual bank loan. I had watched enough big ideas die quietly at that kitchen table over the years to believe this one would too. What I could not ignore, because it landed directly on my desk at the district office, was a public notice. Anytime someone files an application with the state to change a water right, to move its point of diversion or expand its use, the filing becomes public record, and the irrigation district gets a courtesy copy because it affects delivery schedules for everyone downstream. The notice that came across my desk that spring named the 40-acre parcel along the creek, my grandfather's original parcel, the one with the senior right on it, and it proposed changing the water's use from agricultural irrigation to what the filing called commercial and recreational purposes consistent with a planned hospitality development. The applicant of record was listed as Walter Kowalczyk, sole owner. I read that word twice. Sole owner. Frank Alvarez, the district's general manager, noticed me still sitting with the filing, an hour after everyone else had gone to lunch, and asked, in the mild way he asked most things, whether I needed him to pull anything else from the state system to help me make sense of it. Frank had run this district for nearly 20 years and had seen every kind of family fight play out over water at one point or another, cousins who stopped speaking over an eighth of an inch of flow, brothers who took each other to court over a headgate 3 feet from their shared property line. He did not ask whose parcel it was. He did not need to. He just said, quietly, that in his experience, filings like this one usually got quietly withdrawn once somebody who actually understood the underlying title showed up and asked the right question at the right desk, and that if I needed him to make a call to the examiner's office on the district's letterhead, he would do it without asking me a single further thing about my personal life. I thanked him and told him I was not ready yet, that I needed to see the actual deed with my own eyes before I asked anyone else to do anything on my behalf. He nodded like that was exactly the answer he expected from me, and went back to his own office and did not bring it up again until I was ready to bring it up myself. I sat with that filing in my hands for a long while before I called anyone, because a small, tired part of me wondered if I had simply misremembered what my grandfather told me all those years ago, if the key on my ring was sentimental and nothing more, if I had built a story in my head out of an old man's cryptic sentence because I wanted, badly, to still matter to this family on paper the way I had mattered to my grandfather in the orchard rows. But I did not misremember the courthouse. I remembered sitting in that truck. I remembered the folder. I did not call my father that night. I called Hollis Yarnell instead, because Hollis had sat on the district board with my grandfather for over 20 years, had known him since they were both young men figuring out irrigation law from scratch, and if anyone still living had watched Casimir Kowalczyk handle his own affairs with his own two eyes, it was Hollis. Wren, Hollis said, before I had even finished explaining, your grandfather did not do a single thing without thinking 3 steps past where anybody else would stop. If he told you he fixed something, he fixed it. Go look at the deed yourself. Do not take anybody's word for what is on it, including mine. So I did. On my lunch break the following Monday, I drove to the county auditor's recording office in Yakima, a building I had walked into 100 times for district business and never once for anything of my own, and I asked the clerk to pull the recorded deed for the 40-acre parcel along Plumb Creek. It took her about 10 minutes to find it in the older digitized records, and when she printed it and slid it across the counter to me, I read it standing right there at the counter with my coat still on. The deed named 2 grantees, Walter Kowalczyk and Renata Kowalczyk, as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Recorded and notarized the same year my grandfather had handed me that brass key. Not a will, not a suggestion. A recorded deed, filed with the county, plain as anything, with my own name sitting right there in the language, in ink that had never once been a secret, only something nobody had ever thought to ask me about, because nobody had ever imagined I was the kind of person worth asking. I did not get the chance to decide what to do with what I knew before the crisis arrived on its own schedule, the way crises do. I keep thinking back on how ordinary the morning of the stroke was for me, how I was standing at the district office going over drought curtailment numbers with our general manager, Frank Alvarez, worrying about entirely different water, when my phone lit up with Deborah's name for the first time in longer than I could remember. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit before something made me pick it up, and her voice on the other end was smaller than I had ever heard it, scared in a way that had nothing performative left in it at all. Just a woman standing in a hospital hallway asking me to please come, please hurry, and for that first hour driving south, I was not thinking about deeds or parcels or any of it. I was only thinking about my father's face and how much I did not want the last real conversation between us to have been as thin as our last few Sundays had gotten. My father had a stroke on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Mild by the doctor's account, no lasting damage to speech or movement, but enough to land him 3 days in the hospital in Yakima and leave him foggy and frightened for a stretch after. The kind of scare that makes a person suddenly aware of every year they have left instead of every year they have already spent. I drove down the moment Deborah called, sat in the waiting room, held my father's hand when they finally let me back, and for one raw, honest hour, it felt like none of the distance of the last 2 years had happened at all, just a daughter and her father, and a machine beeping steady in the corner. It was in that same hospital, on the second day, that Deborah told me, almost as an afterthought while we stood in the hallway getting coffee from a machine, that she had a general power of attorney my father signed a while back, just in case, standard paperwork, her lawyer had drawn it up, and that with everything so uncertain right now it made sense for her to keep things moving on his behalf so he would not have one more thing weighing on him while he recovered. Keep what things moving? I asked. The sale, she said, like I already knew. The resort group has been patient, but patience has a shelf life in that business, and your father wants this settled, Wren. He has told me a dozen times he wants Cody to have something real to build, something that will outlast all of us. I did not raise my voice in that hallway, though something in my chest went very cold and very still. I asked her when the closing was scheduled. She hesitated for exactly 1 second too long before she answered. 10 days, she said, at the title company. It is just paperwork at this point. Everything has already been agreed to. Just paperwork, I said, and something about hearing her say it that way, in that hallway, under those lights, with my father 1 floor below still tethered to a monitor, made the whole shape of the last 2 years snap into focus at once. The missed calls, the doctor's appointments I was kept out of, the word soul sitting in that filing, all of it arranged now like ditches I finally understood the grade of. I told her I needed to see the purchase agreement. Deborah's face did something complicated, sympathy and irritation both, and she said she would have her lawyer send over whatever paperwork made me feel included, and that she hoped I understood none of this was personal. It was simply what needed to happen for the family to move forward. I told her I understood completely, which was, for the first time in a long time, entirely true. Later that same evening, one of my father's nurses caught me in the corridor, a woman named Sylvia who had worked that floor for as long as I could remember our family using this hospital, and she asked, carefully, whether everything was all right at home, because your father, she said, has asked twice tonight if anyone had heard from you, and each time somebody told him you were already here, he seemed to forget a moment later and ask again. I did not know what to do with that information except carry it, heavy, into the room with me. One more thing Deborah had not mentioned when she talked about keeping things simple for him. I went back into my father's room after that conversation and sat with him a while longer, watching the monitor trace its slow green line, and I found myself studying his hands the way I used to study my grandfather's, looking for some resemblance in how they held things, how they let go of them. My father had always been a man who let other people hold the weight for him, my grandfather first, and now Deborah, and I understood, sitting there, that this was not new cowardice brought on by illness. It was simply the same old habit, grown more dangerous now that the person holding the weight for him had reasons of her own for wanting it heavy in a particular direction. The paperwork arrived 2 days later, a thick envelope from a Yakima law office, and buried in the middle of it, past the purchase and sale agreement and the water right transfer application, was a single page addressed directly to me. A quitclaim deed, already drafted, needing only my signature, releasing any interest I might hold in the 40-acre parcel back to my father, so that title could pass to the resort group clean. The cover letter, polite and bloodless, explained that the original joint tenancy had likely been intended by my grandfather as an informal estate planning gesture rather than a permanent transfer, and that signing would simply correct what was probably a clerical oversight from decades ago, sparing the family an unnecessary complication during an already difficult time. I sat at my kitchen table with that page in front of me longer than I want to admit. I was so tired by then, tired of being the daughter nobody called, tired of the water girl comments, tired of watching my father shrink into a version of himself that agreed with whatever Deborah suggested, because agreeing was easier than the alternative. Some worn-down part of me actually reached for a pen. Signing felt, for about 10 minutes, like the fastest way back to being loved without complication, the way I used to be loved before any of this started. My husband Marcus found me there, pen in hand, page untouched, and he did not tell me what to do, which is one of the reasons I married him. He just read the cover letter over my shoulder twice, slow, and asked one question. If it was really just a clerical oversight, he said, why would a careful man like your grandfather have paid a lawyer, driven to the courthouse, and had it notarized and recorded, instead of just leaving it out of the will by accident, the way an actual oversight would look? I put the pen down. Marcus made tea for both of us while I sat there turning that phrase over, likely intended as an informal estate planning gesture, and the longer I sat with it, the angrier I got. Not the loud kind of angry, the kind that settles into your shoulders and stays there. My grandfather had never done anything informally in his life. He labeled his tools. He kept a ledger of every gallon delivered to every parcel going back decades, in his own careful handwriting, long before the district ever computerized any of it. A man like that did not accidentally drive to a courthouse and accidentally have a deed notarized and accidentally recorded it in the public record. I had spent 2 years letting other people tell me what my own family history meant, and sitting at that kitchen table with Marcus's hand resting quiet on my shoulder, I decided I was done outsourcing that particular judgment to anyone. I called Hollis again that same night, later than was polite, and I asked him to tell me everything he remembered about the day my grandfather signed that deed, not the summary, the actual day. Hollis did not hesitate. He told me he had driven Casimir to the courthouse himself, that Casimir had said on the way there, in almost those exact words, that he loved his son but did not trust the man his son might someday marry, and that he intended to make certain the water on that parcel could never be sold, mortgaged, or given away without his granddaughter's signature on it, for as long as she was living and willing to hold it. "That is not a clerical oversight," Hollis said. "That is a man protecting the one thing he built with his own hands from the one thing he could not control, who his son might love next." I asked Hollis, before we hung up, why my grandfather had never simply told me the whole of it plainly, spared me 2 years of confusion and a stack of paperwork designed to talk me out of my own name. Hollis was quiet a moment, the kind of quiet a person gets when they are deciding how much of a dead friend's private reasoning they have any right to share. He told me your grandfather worried that if you knew too young, you might spend your whole life waiting for the day the paper mattered, watching your father for signs of betrayal instead of just living your life. He wanted you to have an ordinary relationship with your family for as long as that was possible, and a weapon in your pocket for the day it stopped being possible. He did not think you would need it for years yet. He was probably hoping you would never need it at all. That landed harder than almost anything else that week. My grandfather had not been protecting a piece of land from Deborah alone. He had been protecting me from the particular exhaustion of growing up suspicious, and I understood, sitting there with the phone still warm against my ear, that the quiet dignity of that choice was its own kind of inheritance, separate from the acres, separate from the water. The closing was set for a Thursday afternoon at a title company office in downtown Yakima, a squat brick building with a parking lot that never had enough spaces, and I did not tell Deborah I was coming. I did not need to sneak in, not exactly, since I still knew half the people who worked in that building from years of pulling records for the district, and the title officer at the front desk, a woman named Carol who had processed more of our parcel transfers than either of us could count, waved me straight back to conference room 2 without asking a single question. The lot outside was already full when I pulled in, Deborah's leased white Cadillac Escalade taking up 2 spaces near the entrance the way it always managed to, Cody's lifted diesel truck parked crooked beside it, and my own Subaru, dust still on it from the ditch that morning, tucked in at the far end like it belonged to a different afternoon entirely. My father was there, thinner than the last time I had seen him standing, moving slower, but present, upright, his own signature already required on the papers, even with Deborah's power of attorney backing it up in case he faltered. Deborah sat beside him in a cream-colored blazer, and Cody sat across from them with a folder of his own, and at the head of the table sat a man from the resort group I had never met, checking his watch with the particular impatience of someone whose flight home was later that evening. Deborah saw me first, and for one unguarded second before she rearranged her face, I saw something underneath the composure that I had never let myself look for before, something closer to fear than to greed. I want to be honest about that moment, because it is easy, looking back, to make her into a villain with no interior at all, and that would not be true. Deborah had told me once, early in her marriage to my father, almost in passing, about her first husband, how he had left her with nothing when the marriage ended, no house, no savings, nothing in her own name, and how she had rebuilt a life from a rented room and 2 jobs before she ever met my father. Whatever else was true about Deborah, she was a woman who had once had nothing, and who had spent every year since terrified of having nothing again, and Cody was the one certainty she had left in the world, the one thing she still had full control over loving and providing for. I understood, sitting down at that table, that some of what she had done was not cruelty exactly. That was fear wearing cruelty's clothes, because fear does not know any other outfit. And then Deborah looked at my father, whose hand had started to shake slightly around his own pen, and instead of asking him if he was all right, instead of asking if he needed a minute, she leaned in close and said, softly, but not so softly I could not hear it, "We agreed on this, Walt. Do not let her make you doubt it now, not after everything we have already been through to get here." That was the moment the fear I had understood in her stopped mattering as much as what she chose to do with it. Whatever she was afraid of, she was still willing to press a trembling old man's hand toward a signature rather than let him pause. "Carol," I said, Is this closing intending to convey clear and complete title to the buyer today? Carol, sitting quietly at the end of the table with her own stack of documents, looked up and said that yes, that was the intention. Clear title, free and clear of any other interest. Then someone should tell the buyer, I said, keeping my voice level, keeping it slow, the way my grandfather used to count out a head gate turn, that the 40 acres described in this agreement, the parcel that includes the primary water right, has had my name on its recorded deed for 11 years. I am not a lien holder and I am not an heir waiting on a will. I am a joint tenant with right of survivorship, on paper, at the courthouse, and no signature of mine appears anywhere in this stack. The man from the resort group set down his pen very carefully, the way people do when they realize a deal has quietly stopped being a formality. Cody's expression cracked first, somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of real anger. That is not possible, he said. This has been in the works for over a year. Our attorneys pulled title. They pulled a title report, I said, not a courthouse visit. I would know. I do it for a living. I reached into my bag and set the recorded deed on the table, the copy the county clerk had printed for me, the ink and the seal and the two names sitting side by side, exactly where they had sat for 11 years, waiting for someone to finally look. Hollis Yarnell had come with me, standing quietly near the door in his old canvas coat, because I had asked him to, because the genre law of this whole story, if you want to call it that, was never going to let me stand alone in that room without someone from outside the family who had actually watched the truth happen with their own eyes. Carol, he said, I sat on the district board with Casimir Kowalczyk for over 20 years, and I drove him to this county's recording office the day he signed that deed. I remember exactly what he told me on the way there, and I am willing to say it out loud in front of everyone in this room if that is what it takes. Carol did not need him to say it out loud. She had already turned the county's printed deed over in her hands twice, checked the notary stamp against her own records, and set it down with the particular stillness of a professional who has just realized a closing needs to stop immediately. I cannot convey this parcel today, she said, not without Renata Kowalczyk's signature. The title is not clear. I am sorry, but we are done here until this is resolved. Deborah's voice, when it came, had lost every ounce of the softness from a moment before. You knew about this, she said to me, and let us plan around a parcel you knew was not free to sell. I did not know, I said, not until 2 months ago, not until it landed on my desk as a public filing that called my father the sole owner of land my own grandfather made certain would never belong to just one person again. That is the water talking there in that filing, Deborah. Sole owner. Somebody wrote a lie into a government record and hoped nobody who actually reads them for a living would notice. Cody stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. This is exactly why nobody took you seriously, he said, voice rising, the water girl sitting on paperwork for a decade and only pulling it out now to sabotage something real. I did not raise my voice back at him. I let it land, and then I said, quietly, that paperwork is the only reason this land still has water on it at all, Cody. Every acre you drew in your renderings only exists because somebody, for 70 years, showed up every single morning and counted the turns on that wheel honestly, even when nobody was watching, even when nobody thought it mattered. You did not lose today because I sabotaged anything. You lost because you built an entire plan on top of a parcel you never once bothered to actually understand. The man from the resort group cleared his throat and asked, carefully, whether there was any realistic timeline under which this could still be resolved, and Carol told him, not unkindly, that resolving a joint tenancy interest generally required either a willing sale from both owners or a court proceeding neither party wanted, and that in her professional opinion, having watched a great many deals fall apart in that same conference room over the years, this one was not coming back together on any timeline his firm would find worth waiting for. He nodded once, the nod of a man recalculating a return on investment in real time, and began gathering his papers with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already mentally moved on to his next property. Before he left the room, he paused at the door and told me, almost as an aside, that in 15 years of putting these deals together, he had learned to always ask for a courthouse abstract before a title report, and that he would be having a very different conversation with his own attorneys once he got back to his car. It was not an apology exactly, but it was the closest thing to respect I got from anyone in that room who was not already on my side. The room went very quiet after that, the particular quiet of a deal falling apart in real time. My father had not said a single word through any of it. When he finally spoke, his voice came out thin, aimed at the table rather than at any of us. "Wren," he said, "I did not know. I swear to you I did not know what any of this actually said. I believe you," I told him, and I meant it, mostly, though belief and forgiveness are not the same current, even when they run in the same ditch. "I am not signing that quitclaim," I said, to the room in general, to Deborah specifically, though I kept my eyes on my father while I said it. "The parcel stays exactly as my grandfather left it, in both our names, and it stays in agricultural use, because that is the only use the senior water right on it actually protects. If you want to build something on land that does not carry 100 years of somebody else's water rights attached to it, there is plenty of ground in this valley that would let you. This 40 acres is not that ground, and it never will be while I am alive to say so." The resort group's representative was already standing, gathering his folder, already halfway to a phone call he would clearly rather make from his car. Cody followed him out without another word to any of us, and the door swung shut behind them harder than it needed to. Deborah stayed seated a moment longer, looking at my father instead of at me. "This family," she said quietly, "was supposed to finally have something that outlasted all of us." "It already did," I said. "It just was not the thing you were building." She did not answer that. She stood, gathered her purse, and helped my father to his feet with a gentleness that surprised me even then, some genuine care still folded in with everything else, and the two of them walked out together, slower than they had walked in, my father leaning slightly on her arm, the way he used to lean on my grandfather's. I stayed in that conference room a moment after everyone else had gone, Hollis still standing quietly by the door, Carol quietly restacking the papers that would never now be signed. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel after you finally shut off a headgate that has been running too hard for too long, a kind of ringing stillness where the rushing sound used to be. Hollis walked me out to my car, and before I drove off he told me one more thing I have kept close ever since. He said that in 20 years of watching families fight over water rights in this valley, the ones who won cleanly were never the ones who shouted the loudest in a room. They were the ones who had already done the quiet, unglamorous work of being right, long before anyone forced them to prove it. "Your grandfather knew that," he said. "Looks like you did too, whether you meant to learn it or not." The weeks after the closing that never happened moved slower than I expected, the way a creek slows once you finally close the gate all the way and let the ground soak in what it has been owed. The resort group withdrew formally within the month, a short letter to my father's address that Deborah forwarded to me without comment, and the water right transfer application, the one that had first alerted me by naming my father sole owner, was withdrawn from the state's records office once their examiner started asking the same questions I had already answered. The examiner, a careful woman named Priya who handled change applications for our whole basin, called me directly at the district office to confirm what the recorded deed showed, and told me, off the record, that misstating ownership on a state filing was the kind of thing her office took seriously, even when nobody ended up pressing it further, and that whoever had prepared that paperwork for Cody's development group would likely be hearing from her supervisor about it, regardless of how the family matter resolved. I did not ask for that. I did not need to. Some consequences simply arrive on their own schedule once the truth is finally sitting in the right file. Nobody filed charges over the power of attorney, and I did not push anyone to, because my father, once he understood the full shape of what nearly happened, quietly revoked it himself and had a new one drawn up naming me alongside him. Not because he no longer trusted Deborah entirely, but because he finally understood that trust and oversight are not opposites. They are supposed to travel together. Cody left the valley within the season, chasing some other opportunity in a different county, and I do not know what became of his renderings, whether they are rolled up in a closet somewhere or already forgotten, and I find I do not think about him much at all. Someone mentioned once, secondhand, that he had tried to interest a different landowner 2 counties over in a similar idea, tasting room, string lights, the whole vision transplanted onto someone else's acreage, and I hope, honestly, that whoever that landowner is has their own deed checked and their own grandfather's paperwork in order, because Cody's plans were never truly wrong in themselves, only wrong for that particular 40 acres, built on ground that was never his to redraw. Deborah stayed. That part surprised me more than anything else that happened. She and my father are still married, still living in the same house, though something between them has clearly shifted, quieter now, less certain, and I do not know whether she ever told him the truth about the fear that drove her, whether he ever really asked her to. That is not mine to know, and I have made my peace with not knowing it. I see her sometimes at the grocery store, the Fred Meyer out past the highway, and we nod at each other now, careful, civil, 2 women who understand exactly how close we came to losing something and are not yet sure how to talk about it directly. My father calls me most Sundays again, though not every Sunday, and our conversations are shorter than they used to be, more careful, both of us picking our way across ground that still remembers being disturbed. He drove up to the parcel himself, the first time in longer than I could remember, and stood with me at the head gate while I ran the morning water, and he told me, in a voice that cracked halfway through the sentence, that he was sorry, that he had let himself be led, because being led was easier than deciding anything on his own, and that he understood now what his own father had been trying to protect him from, all those years he thought it was only about land. I have not fully forgiven him. I want to be honest about that, because a tidy ending would tell you I have, and this was never a tidy kind of hurt. There is a voicemail on my phone from the week after the closing that I have never deleted and never played all the way through, my father's voice starting in, thin and apologetic, asking me to call him back when I am ready, and I keep it there, unplayed, not because I am punishing him, but because some things are not ready to be finished just because everyone else is ready for them to be. I trust that I will play it someday. I am simply not there yet, and for the first time in my life, I do not feel guilty about taking my own time to arrive. Marcus asked me once why I kept it at all instead of just deleting it, and I told him the truth, that some evidence is not meant for a courtroom or a conference table, it is only meant to prove to yourself, later, on some ordinary morning when you finally feel ready, that the door was never actually locked. I only needed to know it was there. That autumn, my father held the harvest dinner again, later than usual, smaller than it used to be, just a handful of folding tables under the same walnut tree instead of the crowded spread of years past. Deborah helped him set the tables, quiet, careful with him in a way that looked almost tender, and Cody, of course, was not there, off chasing whatever the next opportunity was in whatever the next county turned out to be. I brought a dish of my own this time instead of coming straight from the ditch, and I wore something other than work boots, not because anyone asked me to, but because for the first time in years, I wanted to sit at that table as someone other than the family's quiet function. Nobody stood up with a laptop full of renderings. Nobody called anyone the water girl. My father raised his glass at one point, the way he always used to before things got complicated, and said, simply, that he was grateful the trees were still standing, and grateful the people who mattered to him were too, and left it at that, no big speech, no performance for anyone watching. It was not the family I grew up believing I had. It was smaller and more honest than that one, which, I have come to think, might be the better trade. I went back to work the following Monday like nothing extraordinary had happened, because in a way, nothing had. Water still needed opening on schedule, drought calls still needed making, and the particular quiet satisfaction of a job most people mistake for paperwork settled back over me the way it always had. Except now, I understood it differently. It was never just paperwork. It never had been. My grandfather used to tell me, standing at that same headgate with his thumb worn smooth on that same key, that water remembers who tends it, longer than people remember who loves them. I did not fully understand that sentence for most of my life. I understand it now the way you understand a thing only after it has been tested, which is to say completely, and a little sadly, and without any need to explain it to anyone who has not lived it. My father loved me, I believe that, but it was the water, and the deed, and my grandfather's stubborn, careful faith in structure over feeling, that actually remembered me when it counted, that held a place for me at the table, even during the years my own family nearly forgot to. These days, I still go out to the headgate most mornings before the office opens, the same brass key on my ring, worn now in a second spot where my own thumb rests, right beside the spot my grandfather wore smooth. I still count out loud when I turn the wheel, not because I need to. I know exactly how many turns it takes with my eyes closed, but because counting keeps a person honest and slow. And slow, it turns out, was the entire secret my grandfather was trying to hand me, decades before I understood I would ever need it. I used to think the key only opened water. I know now it also opened a question my grandfather must have carried for years without ever saying it plainly. Who in this family can be trusted with something once it is no longer being watched? He answered that question with a piece of paper filed quietly at a courthouse, and he never once made me feel like a burden for being the answer, only like someone worth trusting with it. People ask me sometimes, when they hear a shortened version of this story, whether I regret not simply signing the quitclaim and keeping the peace, letting my father have his easy path and Deborah her security and Cody his resort. I do not regret it, and I have stopped apologizing for that. Peace built on somebody quietly disappearing is not peace. It is just a longer, quieter kind of erosion, the kind you do not notice until the whole bank is gone. The water is still running on that 40 acres, same senior right, same priority date, same trees my grandfather planted with a borrowed mule. Nothing about the ground itself is any different than it was before any of this happened. What is different is smaller than that, and larger, both at once. Somebody finally checked the paperwork. Somebody finally believed the water girl.